I'd like to welcome everybody. Boise State's Department of Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning is proud to sponsor this Talking Shop webinar. By way of introduction, Dr. Don Kirkey and I met through the ISPI conferences. We've known each other longer than either one of us would care to admit. When I heard that he'd spent time doing a deep dive on onboarding practices, I was keen to ask him to share what he found with our OPWL students, graduates, colleagues, and friends. He's also reserved time to answer your questions. Don, we're just delighted to have you here with us today.
Well, and I am delighted as well. I've been trying to think, but I think it was in Dallas that we met, but it was, shall we say, a while ago. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be talking about evidence-based onboarding practices today, and I think this is particularly appropriate because much of what goes on in both in corporations, in nonprofits, in higher education is not evidence-based when it comes to onboarding. There is there is a fair bit of mediocrity. I'm trying to be kind here, but having spent a lot of time in lots of corporations, there are challenges out there. I have a couple of roles. I am a consultant based in Charlotte, North Carolina. The Trinity Creek Group does a lot of assessment, evaluation, analysis, diagnosis, and helps reorganize learning functions. I am associate graduate faculty at the University of North Carolina, and I've also been adjunct faculty at Boise State in the OPWL program, and I want to shout out to at least two of my former students who have showed up here. My contact information is here. If you haven't not already, you can download the handout later and get my contact information if you like. Before all of this, I spent over 25 years in corporate learning and development and some other functions, but mostly corporate learning and development in both Canada and the United States. And I've been responsible a number of times for new employee orientation and onboarding. This comes not just from my research and my reading, but also from practice and experience. Here's a kind of quick agenda. People like to put up objectives, but the objective is this evening is for all of us to talk and reflect. I'm going to talk about your first days on the job, then I will define onboarding, talk about, I'm going to present three frameworks, if you like, for onboarding practices. One of them comes out of organizational psychology, one of them comes out of positive psychology, the third one, again, from organizational psychology. We'll talk, I've listed applications towards the end, but we're going to pause regularly to discuss applications. And then I have some general observations, particularly for those of you who are students. I want to talk briefly about needs assessment and evaluation as they apply to onboarding. I'm going to when I talk this evening, I will use the language of employees, but I want to underline that all of this research works for volunteers, it works for military people, it works for job training programs. So I've seen this applied in a wide variety of different kinds of organizations. I will, for ease for me, I will talk about employees, but if you're working with, say, volunteers or students or anything else, the research still holds true, and I'll talk about a couple of these ways in a couple of minutes. I started this almost 10 years ago looking at onboarding because my doctoral research was focused on a job training program in intercity Milwaukee that had truly horrendous early dropout rates. 40% of the people would drop out of this job training program in the first 6 weeks. And so I started looking at what could be done in the early days of this organization. And since then, I have gone on to manage new employer orientation and onboarding in a number of companies. Much of what I'm going to talk about this evening probably will sound like common sense. The problem is that it's common sense that most companies ignore, most organizations ignore. Lots of organizations' onboarding programs are ineffective. Some of them are downright counterproductive. And so we will talk about this. Here's, if we were doing this face-to-face or in a small group, I would ask you to unmute, but let me ask you to think about your first few days on a new job or in a new organization. And let me ask you to think about how you felt on that first day, what you needed on the first day, and what do you want on your first day or first days of work. And if you wanted to post something quickly in chat, I'd be interested in hearing from you. I am interested in your experience, but in general, people report stress, anxiety, uncertainty, and those are probably the most common emotions. Steve, if you're monitoring the chat, are there other things people want to call out?
I haven't seen other people posting, but I did post that on my first day, I was just terrified. I was a newbie consultant. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I barely knew my boss. Tara said she wanted a mentor. George said he was lost with no direction.
George, I feel your pain. I started a job once, and all of my employees were out of the office that day, and the man who had hired me was sick. And so I waited in the lobby of this company for 3 hours before the receptionist finally found someone in HR to come and get me and show me that, in fact, I did have a cube. But I sat in the cube with absolutely nothing to do for most of the day. It was very weird.
Katie was overwhelmed. Amy said anxious, excited. I
Yeah.
needed introductions in terms of people and resources. I wanted support. Riley said, I wanted confirmation I made the right decision by taking the job.
Absolutely.
Excitement for new opportunities and beginnings. And Cambria said, anxious when I first arrived. By the end of the day, I was overwhelmed by everything I would need to learn, and I was worried I wouldn't be able to handle it. And Katie said she agrees with Riley.
So those of you who are interested in change management will know that human beings by nature hate uncertainty and will do whatever they can to control or reduce uncertainty. The first few days of work are highly uncertain, and so that puts incredible stress on people. And all of these emotions are perfectly normal, and none of them surprise me. Let's use that as a backdrop to think about this whole issue of starting up in new organizations. What's the fundamental issue here? Goes like this. Right now, we are doing a really poor job, by and large, in most organizations in supporting and retaining new employees. Record low unemployment is exacerbating the problem. And George, if I can pick on you for a second, these are my words, you might not echo them, but you were out in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota, and our current, the unemployment rate where you are is coming close to zero. So that makes keeping people critical. Now, what we know, this is stats from 4 years ago, but with the current unemployment, I don't believe it's any different now. It could even be worse. Half of all hourly workers leave a new job within 4 months. That's an appalling number. And as someone who spent about 7 or 8 years in retail, that many retail organizations would be happy if they only lost half of their new employees within 4 months. Half of all senior, executives, director and above, hires from the outside fail within 18 months. Not all of them leave, unfortunately, but at least half of them fail. The problem that we're facing is truly enormous. These are American figures, and they're all relatively recent. Just as an aside, I am a serious researcher. The title of this says evidence-based onboarding practices, and there is hard research behind all of the things that I'm going to say this evening, but I didn't want to litter my slides with footnotes. So feel free to reach out to me if you want some footnotes, if you would like to know where a particular piece of information came from, if you would like to have some further reading, feel free to reach out. I am happy to share all of that with you. In most cases, I can actually even give you copies. But I am not going to do footnotes. I guess I have 2 footnotes in my presentation this evening, but only 2. Here we go. So if that's the issue, I want to talk about the impact here. So I'm a big fan of systems thinking, and when we think about organizations as systems, systems thinking and systems theory says that there are actually inflection points within systems where that can have a disproportionate impact on the whole organization. I argue that this is one of them. Onboarding, although technically it is a process that it has a profound impact on the organization, and it's often a hidden impact. So, the first few days and the first few weeks are critical. But onboarding takes a while, and I'll give you a definition in a moment. Initial attitudes and experiences, influence subsequent attitudes and behaviors for years. And an example, I suppose, when I was working at Lowe's Home Improvement, I was working in their headquarters, and we revised the new employee orientation and the onboarding program. 2.5 years later, we were able to compare those from the old program and those from the new one. And, they were approximately the same length, but the design was radically different. And what we found is 2.5 years later, those who had been through the new onboarding program were 10 percentage points more engaged and were far more likely to still be with the company 2.5 years later. So we are talking about an event that primarily occurred in 2 days, and 2.5 years later, the impact can be seen in engagement in profound ways. There is not a whole lot else out there where you can have that kind of profound impact. Because I'm at least part-time an academic, I have to give you a definition. So here you go. Onboarding is the process by which an individual learns, adapts to, and integrates into the role, the work group, and the culture of an organization. The point that I want to emphasize here particularly is this is a process, not an event. So too many people think about onboarding as a 2-day workshop or a 1-day workshop or a 2-hour workshop. Onboarding is a process where I learn, I adapt, and I integrate into the organization, into my role, into my team, and into the larger organization. So onboarding is not new employee orientation. New employee orientation is an event that is meant to give you enough knowledge so that you're not dangerous. The research in this space is typically known in organizational psychology is typically referred to as organizational socialization. If you've ever tried to say that 50 or 60 times in a presentation, it doesn't work well. So I'm just going to talk about onboarding, folks. But understand, for those of you from an organizational psychology background, the process I'm talking about is organizational socialization. So let's talk about what organizations do, and as some of them, you know, shout out to the person who asked for mentors. But what typically goes on in an organization? First and foremost, you know, there's an introduction to the organization, and I started in an organization that essentially spent 2 hours telling me how lucky I was that they had hired me. And I'm going to speak to that kind of practice a little later, because that does not get you the impact that you might hope for. But you know, you get some kind of orientation, some introduction to the organization. You get maybe a meet and greet. You may be trained on some essential knowledge and skills that you need to do the work. If the company or the organization is more forward-thinking or more progressive or just plain smarter, you may get a mentor or a coach. There may very well be formal or informal social activities. You may even do some development planning. All of these are actually pretty good practices. The worst I've seen is, and it unfortunately happens in too many organizations, is here's the paperwork you need to fill out for HR, here's where your desk is, here's your laptop, here's the tools you need, have a nice day. That barely qualifies as orientation, certainly doesn't qualify as onboarding. Are there other things that organizations ought to be doing? If you want to put a couple of quick answers in the chat box, I'm interested in what else you think organizations should do.
While we're waiting for the chat, one thing that strikes me is one of the things that Deborah, my boss, did for me was introduce me to the people at an ISPI conference whose work we're drawing on. You know, introduce you to the larger community of practice, introduce you to people who can help you with stuff, who know where stuff is, that social network of practice.
Very cool, and particularly for professionals at kind of the level that you were operating on, that could be really powerful. Steve, did anyone have additional thoughts? I'm going to give you a giant list later, by the way, but if you have thoughts at the moment, let's grab them.
Tara mentioned formative evaluations.
Ooh.
That feedback, how am I doing?
Yes.
George said, I actually started having the leaders, supervisors and managers come and introduce themselves to the new employees.
You know, this is a shout out to George here, because in many organizations, they will have an executive come in and speak, which is actually a nice thing to do. But the research says executives have actually almost no positive or negative impact on onboarding. So they don't help the process at all. But immediate supervisors and managers do help the process, and they help them enormously. So I'm going to move on. I'm mindful of the time here. So I'm going to give you 3 quick frameworks to think about, or 3 concepts to think about when you think about onboarding. And we'll we'll take a couple moments in each case to think about how you might apply these. But let's start with, this is a long-standing research framework that is used widely in the field of organizational socialization, and it has held up really well. So it's this is actually, I guess 40 years old at this point, but it still is applicable. It still works. Even the latest studies are reinforcing it. So they would, the research framework would say there is a spectrum, if you like, between organizational or institutionalized socialization or onboarding and personal or individualized onboarding. And then we would break this down into 6 components. So think spectrum, organizational versus personal, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Most companies or most organizations, processes and programs in onboarding are somewhere in this spectrum. And the critical point I want to make right off the bat, even before I talk about it, is there is not a right or a wrong answer here. So this is not that one is better than the other. There are just trade-offs that have to be made in onboarding. And I want you, as you think about how you onboard people, to think about what outcomes you want and what resources you can apply, because there are implications to your approaches here. So if we think about this framework of organizational versus personal, there are kind of 3 subcategories. One of them is the context. And so one of the questions we ask is onboarding done as a group or is it done individually? So if you onboard people as a group, this collective approach is more organizational. If you onboard people individually, think of this as a more personal approach. Similarly, we ask whether you onboard employees, separate them out, put them into a cohort or a workshop, or whether you do this informally and they're integrated and onboarding occurs on the job. Secondly, we would talk about content, which is, are the activities that go on in your onboarding sequential in a fixed order, or basically are you just given a list of stuff? So first take this class, then meet this person, then proceed to step 3, or here's some stuff for you to do. And so whether it's sequential or random becomes important because of the impact that we know that organizational and personal onboarding has. And finally, is there a fixed timetable? You must complete these activities by these dates, or there are no deadlines. So you can think of this as maybe organizationally directed or self-directed. And third, we would categorize some of the practices as social. And, typically we'd be looking at our job incumbents available or not for onboarding. So if people who are already doing the work are available, that is more organizational. If they are not made available, we would say that's more personal. And we would, the spectrum would be between serial and disjunctive. And also, whether people are provided positive social support or not during onboarding. And, I've had people stop me and say, who does not provide positive social support during onboarding? But I certainly have worked with organizations where until you've proved yourself, you don't get any respect. And that is, there are cultures very much like that. That kind of onboarding would be more personal. Now, keep that framework in mind, and if you grab the handout lays that out in a little table that might be even easier to look at and review later. But here's the findings, and this is the cool part and the important part here. Organizational, so the more that your practices tend towards the organizational side of the house, the more that your employees or volunteers or stakeholders whoever you're dealing with, the more they will have shared values, the less uncertainty and anxiety they will have. And a bunch of you have already said that was a major feeling at the beginning of your work. The more proactive behavior you're going to see. So the more people are going to go out and build relationships and ask people when they need help, which is a critical integration behavior. So you really want to encourage that. The higher the job satisfaction is going to be if your practices tend towards the organizational side, and you will in general have lower turnover. All of those are cool. But again, I said there's trade-offs. Here's two of the or three of the trade-offs, I would say. I don't have a bullet for the third one, but let's start with, this is far more labor intensive. This is expensive. Organizational onboarding practices will cost the organization and will put stress on the resources. The other thing is that you will have greater conformity. So if what you need from your employees is innovation and creativity, organizational onboarding practices will actually discourage that. And they will also, that goes hand in hand with that, there will be a tendency towards a not invented here syndrome. So people who receive organizational onboarding practices are less likely to bring the stuff that they learn from the outside into the organization, because they will have come to develop a loyalty for the organization that actually precludes that. And so there is a downside. There's a lot of upside, but there's a downside. Now, the flip side, personal onboarding practices. The outcome is employees who have greater autonomy, greater independence, more innovative, more creative, and it's cheaper and easier. But employees will also have a lower commitment to the organization and will have higher turnover. So if you're thinking about, one of the logical things that comes out of looking at this is not every one-size-fits-all approach to onboarding, particularly in a large organization, is probably a mistake. So personal onboarding practices may very well work for older and more experienced employees who are self-motivated and are less intimidated, and they bring their experience to the table. Organizational practices are probably more appropriate for newer and less experienced employees. So neither is right, neither is wrong. Here's your trade-offs. And I think there's a critical message here, because most folks have not thought through their onboarding strategies and their onboarding practices. And there are profound trade-offs here. So one of the things that I wanted to put here is to emphasize the trade-offs. The second thing that I would say is, if you think about this framework that I've just presented to you, the impact is approximately in the order of the social, the contextual, and the content practices. So the most profound impact on someone's onboarding experience come from who they learn from and how they learn, even more than what they learn. And for those of you who come from a learning and development perspective, many of us have a bias towards content. And what I would say in onboarding is content is probably the least important. And that's hard for some of us to swallow. It's not what they learn, it's how they learn and who they learn it from that is probably more important. Now, onboarding is still a learning process, but I want to call out those social onboarding practices just a little bit again. They have the strongest possible outcome impact on outcomes, and I'm talking about performance and persistence, if you like, the opposite of job turnover. So the likelihood that people will stay and the likelihood that they will do good work are more impacted by social onboarding practices than anything else. And direct supervisors and coworkers are the ones that have the biggest impact on the onboarding process than anything that the organization can do. Which brings me back to what I was, when I was calling out George, who brings in the supervisors. Executives don't have that much impact. Direct supervisors and coworkers absolutely do. Second point that goes hand in hand with this, you know, it's become a cliche, but it's still true. People will say people don't leave companies, they leave supervisors. The truth is actually more nuanced, but part of the truth is that the research shows that people leave their managers and their coworkers. And for those of you who remember Gallup's famous question about engagement, Gallup found that #1 predictor of engagement on the job was one single thing: do I have a friend at work? Now that seems counterproductive, because they're there to work, but the existence of friends at work is the biggest. Gallup would say it's the biggest predictor of engagement. The research in organizational psychology would say a friend at work is a powerful predictor of both performance and persistence. So you want that. I'm going to give you one more. This is a slide, folks. I am not going to read this. I'm barely going to talk about it. But the point here is onboarding is, to a certain extent, a learning process. And the point that I would like to underscore here is we vastly underestimate the amount that newcomers need to learn. And a couple of you called that out, so you said, formative evaluation. How am I going to be evaluated, and what's the procedure? What's the expectation about fulfilling tasks and functions? What available resources are there? There's a list here. It's in the handout. I'm not going to read it to you. But I do show you this list because you don't necessarily need a formal learning solution for each of these items. But you have to make conscious decisions about each of these items. How are people going to learn this? If you decide they're just going to pick it up, that may very well be an appropriate strategy in your organization, but there are consequences, because if you say they're just going to have to pick up these particular items, you are saying for these, our onboarding strategy is a personal one, which has consequences for turnover and company loyalty. The other thing, the other reason I show people this really big list of stuff you ought to know is that many organizations still think that onboarding process could be addressed by a 2-hour orientation. There is no 2 hours that's going to pack this in, folks. I will, so I will just move on. Let's pause for a moment, and Steve, we have 17 people online, so that's probably a bit much for everyone to unmute, but if you wanted to post something in the chat, what are some of the implications of this research, and what are some of the applications for the research, the stuff that I've just talked to you about? And while you're filling that out, I'll give you 2 things. I'm a big fan of self-directed learning, but I got to tell you that self-directed learning is what? It's a personal onboarding strategy. So if you are using self-directed learning as part of your onboarding strategy, understand the implications of that. There is a lot of conversation these days about online onboarding. Same thing. Online onboarding actually can be quite efficient. However, it is very much a personal strategy with all the implications that come with that. One other thing that I would say when I think about this particular research and some of its applications is when I have talked to organizations, most of them are so focused on efficiency that they have essentially forgotten effectiveness. And so this is about what's effective. Now, you still have to make tough decisions about resources and time and people and labor and all those good questions. But understand what I'm talking about here is what's effective. Then you have to balance it with your own sense of efficiency. Unfortunately, most organizations are just looking at efficiency and not looking at effectiveness. Steve, do we have any comments out there?
Yeah, Mike Denny asked, is there a middle ground? And I think he means, is there a middle ground between organizational and personal onboarding tactics?
Yeah, my point is to use that framework to think about the things that people need to learn. And when you use that framework, you're going to make a series of decisions that are wrapped around how important is this for us. And if it is really important that people understand those things, then we may want to take a more organizational approach. If it is less important, we may very well want to take a personal approach. So the reason I set this up as a spectrum is, in fact, you're going to make mindful decisions. My hope when people look at this framework is that these decisions really are mindful. That's the whole point.
And Riley's asked, is there any research that pre-hiring decisions like referrals provide a built-in friend, thus increasing the likelihood of retention?
Yes.
Well, that was fast.
So for those, referrals from a friend have a profound impact on your likelihood to both perform and to stay with an organization. You already have a friend. The downside is for those of you that are looking for diversity, and that could be racial, ethnic, or it could very well be different perspectives and different ideas and different attitudes. Relying primarily on those kinds of recommendations reduces diversity, because people refer people that they know and like and hang out with and are probably already like. So there is a slight downside to that. It does improve performance and persistence. It just hurts diversity. I'm going to pass. I'm mindful of the time. By the way, for those of you, we're supposed to wrap this up in about 15 or so minutes, but I'm prepared to stay on if people do have questions. But there's a couple of things I want to touch on to be respectful of those who really must leave in 15 minutes. Those of you who are not familiar, in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been an explosion in the field of positive psychology. And positive psychology essentially had its roots in a kind of rebellion against classic psychology, which was focused on looking at sick people and figuring out how to make them well, and instead shifted the focus to start looking at good people, successful people, healthy people, and trying to figure out what we can learn from them. And there's been some really interesting stuff that has come out of that. One quick example that I want to give you, because it's a nice way to counteract kind of the downsides of organizational and personal onboarding. Positive psychology has shown that even really small positive affirmations on the first day or two on the new job have a profound impact that lasts for years on both performance and on tenure or persistence. And the people, obviously, again, coming back to this familiar theme, the people who are most likely to have the biggest effect are your direct supervisors and coworkers. Now, why I want to call that out is most onboarding programs are wrapped around how we do things here, what's expected of you, why you should be proud of this company. I mentioned earlier a company that spent an hour telling me how lucky I was that I had been hired by them. Here I was thinking they were lucky to have me, but apparently not. So employees that are encouraged to recognize and leverage their unique strengths and bring their authentic selves to work, and turns out are more engaged, more productive, more connected, and more likely to stay. That doesn't seem like rocket science, but that's not normally the message that many organizations are delivering. So if you want to think about, if you tell people why and affirm why they were hired, we hired you because you're great at this, or we're hired you because you have this background in X, or you appear to be an expert in Y, those things actually shape your attitude towards the organization and make you much more productive. And these kind of practices particularly go on in some famous companies like Zappos and Southwest, but I want to call out Wipro rather, which is a Bangalore-based IT company, and they're a really interesting example because in Bangalore they have this call center with literally thousands of people, and they set up a control group and a study group, and ran this experiment with hundreds of new employees that were being onboarded simultaneously. Their normal onboarding program was the classic call center. Here's everything you need to know in the next 2 months, and then we're going to put you on calls. What they did was put half of the new hires through a program where they went through the 2 months, and the other half, the only difference with the other half was the insertion of 2 hours where they discussed how happy they were that these people had joined the company. They had them introduce themselves and affirm the strengths that they were going to bring to their future job. And that was the only difference. Now, understand that Wipro started this at a time when at 6 months, 70% of their employees had left. And what they found is for those who were treated as if you like, for those who spent the 1 or 2 hours, one curious and amusing part of this onboarding is the people who went through the control group were given a Wipro t-shirt, and it just said Wipro, and it was a huge logo on the front of their t-shirt. The people who went through the treatment group were given a t-shirt with a small Wipro logo on their chest and their name in big letters on the back of their t-shirt. The whole point was to affirm who they are and what they brought, that they were important members of the team. But what they found is at the 6-month mark, those who had received just 1 or 2 hours of positive affirmation, their tenure, their persistence, if you like, was up 32%. The customer satisfaction from people who spoke to those employees was up 11%, and their engagement was up as well. So when I say this is a pivotal, I'm serious. We're talking here about 1 or 2 hours that have a profound impact on a call center. So there's real potential in some of this. Now, think about some of the implications for this research and some of the applications, but these are pretty obvious. And I'm going to give you one more concept, and then we can spend some time talking. So this is a concept from organizational psychology, job embeddedness. And this is really, again, this is a common sense concept, but unfortunately, generally it plays almost no role in organizational onboarding programs. Embeddedness is this construct or concept that there's a web of forces and factors that connect me to my job, my organization, and my community. And the more and the stronger those connections are, the more likely I am to stay and the more likely I am to perform well. So hand in hand with that, it goes this concept of sacrifice. The more embedded I am, so the stronger the web of forces and factors, the greater the psychological cost there is of leaving. Now, why would I care about this concept of embeddedness? So a couple of things as we elaborate on embeddedness. There's both on-the-job and off-the-job embeddedness. Think in both cases, there's a social and a financial component. I'm not going to read the slides completely, but do you have social links? Do you have a friend? Do you have more than one friend? Do you have a mentor? Do you have a coach? Do you have a good relationship with your supervisor? Is there not just the salary and the benefits, but is there, for example, a raise after 3 months, after 6 months, after a year? Is there vesting of stock if you're higher up? Or is there promotion potential? All of these are links that will tie you to the organization. But also the off the job. Do you have social links within the community? Do you have financial links within the community? Does your spouse or significant other have employment in the community? Are you involved in other financial enterprises? Do you own a home? All of those are links that would embed you in the job. Now, why should you care about embeddedness? Because embeddedness is stable, the impact of embeddedness is profoundly stable, and it really does not matter whether you are happy or sad. Mood is almost irrelevant when it comes to embeddedness. So even if you are by nature a manic depressive, you will, if you are embedded, you are still going to be more likely to stay and more likely to perform better. So this is a profoundly stable concept. On-the-job embeddedness predicts both performance and persistence, which is critical. So it's not just that you're going to stay, but you're going to do better work. Off-the-job embeddedness predicts persistence. If I have connections to the community, I am much more likely to stay as well. Now, organizational onboarding practices encourage embeddedness. So, what are some of the implications of this research and one of the applications? Again, I'll leave you some time a little towards the afterward. But when I was working with an inner city Milwaukee job training program, the existence of mentors and work buddies became critical. If we could get those people, the participants in this job training program, to find a friend at work quickly, they were much more likely to stay. We worked particularly hard to help them build social connections, and most of them were court involved, so we were looking for non-gang. To be frank, we were looking to help them understand that they could have fun in ways that didn't include drugs or alcohol. But the same research was applied when I worked at Lowe's Home Improvement. We had really high turnover among executives, and we're losing executives far too quickly, particularly in some critical positions. So we helped embed them in the community. Now, you can't do this for every employee, but for critical executives, we help them find roles on boards of directors. We help them connect them to churches or religious organizations or civic organizations. We help their kids get involved in Little League. We found, or soccer. We found out whatever it was that they were interested in, and we worked hard actually to embed them into the community so that they would not disappear on us. Because we knew that the more embedded they were, the more likely they were to stick around. I'm going to make some quick observations here, particularly for those of you who are in the OPWL program, and then I think we could go to microphone after that, Steve. Evaluating onboarding. As I said earlier, every onboarding program is a trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. Unfortunately, efficiency usually wins, and there's a real challenge there. When you are evaluating onboarding, typically you take a program, even though it's a process, I would argue, take a program evaluation approach to it. Often I would compare onboarding against best practices, and there's two reasons for that. One of them is most onboarding is grown up organically and is not really part of a comprehensive and thoughtful design. So comparing design outcomes with something that is that disorganized is often a challenge. The other thing is that onboarding is often highly politicized inside organizations. So showing executives best practice from other or even similar companies is particularly helpful when you are criticizing or appear to be criticizing something that they might have had a hand in creating. And Steve, originally your question was about needs assessment, and I would argue I think onboarding is actually more like a solution than it's a need. So you know, we can kind of, it's a need in the sense that I need to learn these things and I need to be integrated into the team and the role of the team and the organization. But it is frequently viewed much more like a solution or a program than it is like a need. If you are doing needs assessment, look for really high early turnover, really low early performance, really low engagement. Those are probably symptoms that tell you to start looking at the onboarding. There are so many variables that might cause these symptoms that I don't want you to start with, we have high early turnover, therefore it's an onboarding problem. But it may be. So there's one place that you want to look. Think broadly, really broadly, when it comes to onboarding about what people need and when they need it to be successful in the role, the team, and the organization, and then ask yourself how and when is that enabled. In some cases, the decision may be they're on their own. That's okay, as long as you understand that there are impacts when that happens. So I've given you just 3 concepts or a framework and 2 additional concepts. I am always happy to speak to any of you more, so we can set up a time to talk. But we're almost out of time. Steve, I'm happy to hang around if you are and answer additional questions. Did I lose Steve?
No, Steve's still here.
Okay.
And I guess at this point, if people have other things to do, it's certainly okay to drop off. Otherwise, we're going to continue the webinar for a little longer so that people can ask their questions. The first one comes from George, who asked, is there information on retention longevity on folks who travel to work, for example, 30+ miles, as opposed to those who already live in the community?
Wow. I haven't seen anything specific. If I was, I would expect that the further you travel, the less persistent you are, but I haven't seen any research that goes there for sure, George. That's a good question, and given the geography you're dealing with. What other questions are out there?
While we're waiting for questions to come in on the chat line, I do have a question, and that is, we've talked a lot about how poor onboarding is unfortunately more a norm than a practice.
Yep.
Are there any examples of people or organizations who do that well, both from the organizational and from the personal side?
There are examples of some organizations that do some elements of this well. As I've mentioned, there's this profound trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness, and so there are organizations that are making better choices, but there isn't a perfect onboarding scheme. So Southwest Airlines and Zappos do pretty good job. There is some other organizations that do as well. What you'll find is organizations that place a high value on their people already probably do better at onboarding. Not to make a terrible generalization, but I certainly, this is almost, the onboarding goes hand in hand with their attitude towards their employees. They slow down, they take time, they take care of their employees. And if they do that, they are likely to take a different approach to onboarding.
Jason Riley commented, let's face it, there's some new hires you don't want to stick around. How do you add the social aspect as people adjust to your desired culture and values and weed out those who aren't good matches or who don't conform?
True. So, this is onboarding has a profound impact on an organization, assuming that they are making good hires. That's a really big assumption. And if they are making poor hires, that's Steve, you worked with a lot of clients. I've worked in large organizations, and I've had that conversation. And sometimes the honest answer is, I can't turn this person into an engaged and productive employee. There is only so much that can be done to offset a poor hiring decision. So they will, if you onboard them well, they are more likely to perform and more likely to stay. But if you onboard them well, they may very well recognize that they don't belong, and they may self-select out as well. If it becomes clear what the true environment is like, what the true organization is, and what it really values, hopefully they'll self-select out. Can't fix bad hiring, not easily anyway.
Mike asks, I work for a very small company. Does that automatically tilt the onboarding towards personal as opposed to organizational?
It does, but I want to emphasize, Mike, when you look at that framework, the most important stuff are the social elements of onboarding, and you can do those well. So you can celebrate the person when they arrive, and you can take them, the whole team can take them to lunch, and you can, and they can spend rich, valuable time with their coworkers and with their supervisor, and that kind of offsets some of that stuff. That's what you don't want, is them coming away with the impression that they're on their own. And in a smaller organization, you can avoid those sorts of things, even though you're, by nature, you're probably only onboarding one person at a time. Other questions out there?
Last question from Mike. Can OPWL post a copy of your slide deck as well as the handout?
I don't think there's much in my slide deck that isn't in the handout, but I suppose so. It's a stylistic thing. There are people who like to summarize their presentation and those who like to hand out slides. I'm not one who really cares to hand out slides. But I will look at the handout because, Steve, you and I talked about that, and there may be a couple of points from the slides that are missing from the handout. And if that's the case, I'm happy to add them into the handout. That might be a better compromise for me.
Okay. Our stream of questions seems to have come to an end. And so on behalf of us, thank you so much, Dawn, for sharing your expertise and your research with us.
Well, thank you all. It's fun. You can tell I'm passionate, and as I said, I'm happy to hear from anybody who wants to talk about this more, either by email or set up a conversation.